I'd like to welcome uh, everybody to participate in this in this webinar, and as part of webinar series that Center for Social Change is organizing. So this is our first webinar, which is mostly focusing on the title of strengthening nonviolent action in the midst of COVID-19 crisis, and what are the challenges, opportunities, and strategies to strengthen those movements. So those of you who are not familiar with the Center for Social Change, it's a Kathmandu-based research and advocacy organization, mainly working on issues around conflict prevention, migration, governance, and civic engagement. So Center for Social Change does research. We also run educational programs such as South Asia Regional Institute on the Study and Practice of Nonviolent Action. We also do a lot of academic and policy discourse and discussion program on various socio-political issues. So one of the reason why we decided to organize this webinar is basically related to two main reasons. Like, there are two main reasons why we're motivated to organize this webinar. The first one is the civic resistance movement that were ongoing around the world. Could be the farmers movement or the women's right movement, LGBTQ movement, or anti-corruption movement. So those movements are kind of halted, or kind of lost their momentum at the moment due to COVID-19 crisis. And so we're kind of concerned that how this movement will find their way in the midst of COVID-19. So that's one of the major questions we are kind of thinking about. The second thing is as because of this COVID-19, it has also created a ground for the emergence and expansion of number of civic resistance movement around the world. So particularly those movements are associated with the government's inability to address the socioeconomic needs of the people at ground, the government's failure, effective delivery of ineffective delivery of public services, growing authoritarianism around the world, and so on. Like, there are a number of issues that has been emerged as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. So how these new waves of movement will go ahead, or will find their way along with kind of the old old kind of non-violence movement. I think we really need to discuss on the challenges and opportunities associated with both old and new forms of civic resistance movement, and strengthen and find out strategies to strengthen these movements for achieving the desired goal. So in this context, we have invited four prominent speakers from South Asia as well as internationally to talk on this issue. And so I first would like to introduce our four speakers for this webinar, and then we'll proceed to the presentation. So so first of all, I'd like to introduce Professor Isak Svensson. Professor Svensson is at the Department of Peace and Conflict Research at Uppsala University, Sweden, and he was also a former director of research at the National Center for Peace and Conflict Studies at University of Otago, New Zealand. He has three main areas of expertise: international mediation in civil wars, religion and conflict resolution, and the dynamics of strategic nonviolent conflicts. So he has published and edited 10 books and over 50 articles in international academic journals, including Journal of Peace Research, Journal of Conflict Resolution, European Journal of International Relations and International Negotiations, many more. And Isak is also a project leader for the research project Ballots Without Bullets, Exploring Nonviolent Conflicts. He also leads a data collection project, Violence in Civil Protests, data at the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, and teaches the course Nonviolent Conflicts, Causes, Strategies, and Outcomes at the master level at the Department of Peace and Conflict Research. Svensson is also currently leading a survey-based project on explaining individual level participation in the nonviolent uprising in Nepal 2006. And the survey findings will be coming out in the form of book and journal article, hopefully within 2020. So our second speaker is Mr. Ramesh Chandra Sharma. Mr. Sharma works as the national convener of Ekta Parishad. Ekta Parishad is a mass-based people's movement for land rights with an active membership, of 250,000 landless poor, and is regarded as one of the largest, one of the biggest people's movement in India, with an iconic status globally. As a campaigner, Ramesh is one of the leaders of many large-scale mass struggles, such as Janades 2007, Jana Satyagraha 2012, Jana Andolan 2018, and in the last 20 years, Ramesh has played an instrumental role in strengthening and expanding Ekta Parishad as one of the most significant people's struggle for land rights. Ramesh has also traveled and works in solidarity with land rights movements in various countries. He's also an active member of various global and national alliances working on land rights issues. Currently, he is International Coordination Committee member and leader of Global Walk for Justice and Peace. So our next speaker is Dr. Dinesh Prasain. Dr. Prasain was one of the leading civil society figures during 2006 Nonviolent People's Movement of Nepal. Dr. Prasain has earned his doctoral degree from Jawaharlal University from New Delhi, India. His focus is on political sociology with research interest in citizenship, globalization, transnationalism, political communications, and social change. He has published several articles in a number of national and international peer-reviewed journals and edited volume. Currently, he teaches MPhil program at the Sociology Department at Tribhuvan University, Kathmandu, Nepal. And our last but not the least, our another speaker is Rehena Wagha. Rehena Wagha has earned her MPhil in International Relations from Quaid-e-Azam University, Islamabad. Currently, she is pursuing her PhD at the same university, researching on women's agency in war and conflict situations. She's associated with women's rights movement, since her college days, while keeping in touch with women's at the grassroots. And also, she has been an active member of South Asia Feminist Alliance, SAFA, for ESCR, and Women's Action for Better Workplaces. Moreover, she worked with National Commission on the Status of Women in Pakistan. Her sheer commitment with women's rights brought her to Women Regional Network as a country coordinator. Besides, she has been teaching at various universities in Islamabad as a visiting lecturer. Gender, peace, and security is the major area for focus in teaching and research. So we really, on behalf of Center for Social Change, we really would like to thank you all for, prominent speakers, and I'm very sure that, your several years of experience and research and teaching and practices will be really useful for this webinar. So, so I'd like to start with Professor Isak Svensson to give his presentations, and every speaker will get 15 minutes to speak, and then remaining time we have allocated for question and answer session. So we'd like to start with Professor Svensson. Floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Prakash, for organizing this great event. Thank you, Center for Social Change. My name is Isak Svensson. I'm at Uppsala University. I would like to share the screen, but the host needs to enable screen sharing. So Pawan, could you enable screen sharing, please? Or alternatively, you can screen share the PowerPoint I sent you.
Yeah, just
I start to say a few words as you go ahead. Okay, we'll see whether we can manage the screen sharing here. Okay, excellent. So I would like to say a few words of some general remarks, and I'm happy to be in such an eminent group of scholars and practitioners, and I look forward to the discussion. My comments is of a more general nature. I would like to give a bit of background to the situation that we are in right now, and try to see whether research, which is really a field that has been growing a lot the last decade or so, research on nonviolence action, can help us to understand the situation we are in and what will come. So could you please switch to the first slide? So it's important, I think, to remind ourselves the background to the situation, the world before the corona crisis, COVID-19. Here you see a chart on major nonviolent uprisings. This is a chart looking at the onset of nonviolent uprisings from the beginning of the 90s up to 2016. The blue tables in here identify the frequency of nonviolent uprisings. And it helps to illustrate an important point, and that is that the use of civil action, civil resistance, nonviolent uprising, whatever you want to call it, and there is a bit of terminology diffusion in this field, but kind of unconventional measures that goes beyond conventional politics, but short of violence, to try to challenge the status quo, has been increasing over the decades. So nonviolent action has been on an increase. We have seen more and more examples of people taking to the street, protesting, demonstrating, engaging in self-organization, engaging in non-cooperation, taking different types of measures to try to challenge the status quo beyond conventional politics. And last year, Pawan, if you changed 2019, we could see that this was really on an increase. 2019 was the year where we saw all over the world massive demonstrations. And here are just a few. In the middle, you can see, if you go back there, please. In the middle, you could see the Sudan case, Sudan, where a popular uprising helped to overthrow a decade-long authoritarian leader regime, in which women and women organizations played a pivotal role in creating this change. You could see examples from Lebanon, where despair over the economic situation led to a massive demonstration, primarily driven by young people. Also in Chile, in South America, you can see examples here from massive demonstration. Below, you can see Hong Kong. And here we have the climate demonstrations in which young people, particularly young women, young girls, and Greta Thunberg is included here as one of the initial mover in this global movement, have been taken to the streets. I come from Stockholm, and last year we had the largest demonstrations ever held for climate, for a rapid climate action. So the world before COVID-19 saw a massive increase in civil action in these type of mass protests. Next slide, please. The immediate effect of the COVID has been a dramatic decrease, just as Prakash pointed out in his introductory remarks. And here are just examples from demonstrations and protests. This is from the ACLED data. This is from Middle East and Africa. And the arrows here are pointing to a sharp decrease in protests following the COVID crisis. And this is, of course, driven by two things. First of all, that it's very difficult for organizations to organize. People hesitate to go out to the streets. Often in many countries, it's forbidden to go out to the streets and participate in massive movements. In other places, it's not recommended. And people hesitate to engage in these kinds of activities because of the health repercussions. It is also that the COVID issue has taken up the momentum and urgency from other movements. So it has come to the agenda and superseded other pressing issues because of its immediate character. So the immediate effect, of course, is a drop in the protests. But what would be the long-term effects of the COVID protests? And here I think we can make use of some insights from research on nonviolent uprisings. Next slide, please. If we go to research, we can see that there are three major theoretical explanations for why we see nonviolent action. And we scholars, we like to quarrel among ourselves which one is the best explanation. And we have an academic debate on sort of, is it this or this factor that is the most important? But in reality, most would see that these three types of explanation, all of them will help us to understand when civil resistance and nonviolent action occur. They all have some validity to them, although the balance between them may differ to context. But the three different explanations is, first of all, grievances. That has to do with the motivations of actors, that there are something that individuals, groups, communities are unsatisfied with, that they have grievances. These can be long-term grievances, economic grievances, political grievances, security grievances, felt a sense of insecurity. They can also be immediate effects. Research here talk about sort of shocks, moral shocks, situations where the motivations of parties are triggered by immediate effects. So this is one of the explanations for why we see nonviolent uprising. The second explanation is resource mobilization. And that has more to do with the capability, not so much with the motivations, but with the capabilities of those that are seeking to challenge status quo. Many communities have grievances, but not all communities, organizations, actors are able to launch nonviolent action and civil resistance. And what explains those groups that remain passive from those that actually take up action is the mobilization resources that they have access to. This is sort of organizational capital. It is membership in organizations that exist. It's the possibility to share information, to control information channels, to coordinate amongst yourself, to create a momentum and coordination. So to draw on already established organizations, and that has been shown to be one of the key explanations for why we see nonviolent actions, that alive and active civil society can draw on the resources that they have already access to. The last explanation is political opportunity. That has to do with the capability as well, but more on the capability of the side that is challenged, commonly the government side, the regime side. Political opportunity explanations say that when we see nonviolent uprisings, when we see civil action, that has to do with shifts on the government side. That could be, for instance, situations of there is a political opportunity in terms of an election. There is some transformative event. Please go back. There could be situations where you have divisions within the ruling elite. It could be a situation where you have a partial opening of a society that has been very closed. It could also be a situation where you have less of repression than you had before. So political opportunity explanations usually focus on that there are some types of opportunities, some openings in the structure, which civil society organizations can take the advantage of. Now let us think of the long-term effect of COVID-19 from these three common conventional explanations. We would expect overall that the grievances will actually be increasing in the world. So one of the consequences of COVID-19 will be the economic crisis that the world is now going through. Right? And we are just in the starting of this. And this will affect all countries of the world. Of course, it will affect those that are poorer more than those that are wealthier. But it will affect us all. And therefore, it will most likely increase the sense of grievances that already exist. COVID is not a cause in and by itself, but it can multiply the already existing tensions that are in there in a society. If we think about resource mobilization, there could be different arguments for how this will affect different organizations. The immediate effect, as we have seen, is a rapid decrease in the possibility to physically meet and to manifest dissent in the way that many organizations and many civil society organizations try to do, and civil society actors try to manifest dissent, for instance, through protests or demonstrations. Some of this have been moved to online formats, that civil society organizations has kept on their activities, but they have moved to other arenas, for instance, through web-based organizations. And the seminar that we are presently holding is an example of this. We are continuing to self-organize, but through other formats. We can draw from previous experiences. Many of you will recall the so-called Arab Spring of 2011, which was called the Twitter revolution, where the use of social media was argued to play a key role. Actually, if you start to look into that event, you could see that, yes, social media did play a role, but what really got the situation more transformative was when the Mubarak regime closed down the social media and people were forced to not only sit and chat on their computers, but actually go out on the streets and do something. So there is a bit of risk to think that relying on sort of solely on internet mobilization will fully replace the traditional ways of organizing dissent. Next slide, please. I just have a few couple of minutes, so I will go through these quite quickly, but just to frame the overall effects that we can see in terms of these, and I think we will come back to this in the discussion. But we can see some problematic long-term effects in some countries. We can mention Hungary, we can mention Turkey, Poland, Egypt, Philippines, Israel, Poland. We have seen that the regimes have taken use of the opportunity of the COVID-19 crisis to implement measures that decrease the level of democracy. So the state, through this crisis, is becoming stronger. And that is a risk. I see that the process that we have seen the last year of de-democratization will be further enhanced. Second, we mentioned the economic crisis will be one of the worst economic crises probably that we have suffered for the last decades. We have also seen evidence of weakened international collaboration, heightened tension between US and China. We have seen that the international organizations have not been able to coordinate in an efficient manner fully. And the efforts, for instance, the call from the Secretary General of the United Nations to call for a global ceasefire has not generated a global peace that we could have imagined coming in the wake of the COVID-19. Next slide, please. We should also see that there are some potentials here. There are some potential advantages of the crisis, so to say. Some things that may come out from the crisis. And I'm happy to share the slides with you all. First of all, we can see that there has been a lot of initiatives, a lot of solidarity, acts of solidarity, and a lot of initiatives from the bottom up, a lot of innovative social collaboration in the wake of COVID-19, which is really interesting. Secondly, we can see that the societies are very rapid to transform themselves. And if we think about the climate change or other issues of systematic change, demanding systematic change, we can see that these types of systematic changes can happen very rapidly, and people can come to accept transformative change in just a couple of days, which I think is quite interesting. We also see that a potential positive effect is that our societies are growing more resilient against crisis. And the last slide, please. So what I would like to put on the agenda for a discussion today is how we can think about nonviolent action in the midst of COVID-19 crisis. And here I think there are some key aspects that we should discuss. And one of them is the need for tactical adaptation and innovation. We know from previous research that this is a key dimension for explaining success of nonviolent uprisings, of civil action. Those movements that are able to adapt to the situation that they are in, that are able to innovate new approaches, new techniques, take new initiatives, are more likely to have a leverage, to have a higher leverage, and to be resilient to potential repression and other situations. Secondly, previous research has pointed to the role of mass participation as the key for success. That mass participation is the reason for why nonviolent uprisings tend to be more successful, actually, than violent uprisings. Well, do we need to reconsider the role of mass participation? Will COVID-19 lead will we find a cure for it so that we can meet again physically? If not, will we have to rethink the role of mass participation and other avenues for physical meetings? Third, the resilience of movements. I talked about the resilience of societies. We know that resilience is also one of the key issues for why nonviolent movements are successful, that they are able to bounce back after they are facing repression. Will movements also be resilient in these kind of hard times? And how could that resilience manifest itself? Once again, thank you so much, Prakash and Center for Social Change, for taking this initiative, and I look forward to the further discussion.
Thank you, Isak, for a very wonderful presentation, and thank you putting those 3 points for the discussions. I'd like to request all participants, to note down your questions, and if you just post it in the chat box now, then it will be very difficult to scroll up or down. So you can just save those questions and ask with specific speakers later on. So now I'd like to request Mr. Ramesh Chandra Sharma to give his presentations, and like Isak, you'll also have 15 minutes to share your perspectives. So floor is yours, Mr. Sharma.
That's okay. Yeah, thank you, Pawan, and thanks to all of you for this wonderful gathering and giving me this opportunity to share some of our experiences from the ground. And namaste to all of you from India. Now world is start saying namaste. So very briefly, I would like to give you an overview that which kind of nonviolent action we are doing right now here in India. And probably I'll also share some of our experiences which is coming from the villages. As Pawan, you rightly mentioned that Ekta Parishad is a membership-based people's organization. And the larger focus of Ekta Parishad is to challenge the structural violence. Of course, the physical violence, whatever the happening around us, are extremely important, but also invest sufficient time and energy to understand the larger spectrum of the structural violence. And that's how we thought it's our duty as a people's movement to understand and to build the momentum around the structural violence. When we say structural violence, that means poverty, injustice, inequality, discrimination, etc. So in the last few years, we did several actions, but what we have learned out of our several actions, that the direct violence, it's like a tip of the iceberg. Most of the time, we see the direct violence, which is so visible around us, but we also need to understand that what are the underneath of the iceberg. That means the root cause, which is affecting a large sum of people, which actually responsible to make a large number of people deprived out of their rights. And this is important to get a sustainable solution, a sustainable non-violent solution through our action. So this is the little background about Ekta Parishad. How we understand the structural violence in today's context. I'm specifically talking about the India. Probably you heard a large number of migrant workers, millions of migrant workers, they are walking from the metro cities to their villages. In some places, there are some sad stories how they were killed either by the train accident or by the road accident, etc. So they were the people, they were the migrant laborers largely who are the victims of the hungers and discrimination, the tip of the iceberg. But what are the reality? Why they are in that particular situation? Because of the anti-poor laws, policies, institutions who are somehow irresponsibly dealt with those issues over last 70 years. So that's why we say that these are the people who are like a second and third generation of poor. They are not the first generation poor, actually. And this is the underneath. So we need to understand the tip of the iceberg. It's the whatever we are looking in the roadside, as well as what's underneath. How Ekta Parishad is addressing all these issues. So together we have actually drawn what we call 4-phase plan. And this is not like phase 1, phase 2, but it's like overlapping. Of course, we think that our prime responsibility is to go and to reach out to those migrant workers and to ensure the food supplies. And we are trying our best to help them buy food supplies and travel assistance also. But the second part is also very important for us, what we call building a common property resources. They were the world they are the people who are the resourceless, who are the resource poor. And that's how this is one prime reason why they are migrating to the big cities for getting their job or employment or livelihood. So we are also trying to focus to build the common property resources in their villages. The third is, of course, strengthening the local economy, what we call decentralized economy. And fourth part, which is extremely important as a people's movement for Ekta Parishad, is campaigning and advocacy for pro-poor laws and policy, and to understand the structural justice. So let me give you one picture that what are the structural violence today, how we understand the structural violence today in the context of COVID-19 or in the situation of lockdown. As I said, that the large sum of migrant workers, they are the rootless. They don't have land in the villages. That's why they are migrating to the big cities. Unless there's no land reforms in the countryside, no one can stop them to go and to earn their livelihood in the big cities. So this shows the gross failure of land reforms in India. 56% of landless poor are equal to 170 million of migrant laborers who are walking to the big cities for getting their livelihood. So you can understand the whole volume of how landlessness is affecting the crisis. And as I said, they are the second and third generation of landless and homeless poor. They were the one who lost their land. They were the one who never ensured any dignified piece of land or livelihood in their villages. That's why they are migrating. So we try to understand that these are the new structure of violence. The forced and undignified migration. See, they neither have resources or nor opportunities in their villages. So all the resources and opportunities is focused to few hands. It's actually in the hands of only few people in the country. So the whole mismatch between the resources and opportunities are actually responsible to push them in the big cities. And that's easy to understand. And you can see the situation in various states of India. The third is a psychological trauma. Believe me, we did an extensive survey over last 40 days, and we have reached out to more than close to 100,000 migrant workers across India who are locked down in different places. 96% of those migrant workers, they would like to go back their home. They don't want to stay. Few months back or few weeks back, with a big hope, they came to the big cities to earn some money so that they can survive for the whole year. They are empty hands. But even after empty hands, they would like to go back to their native villages. So it's not just a question of economic insecurity. There is a lot of things is happening in the mind, which we need to understand. And no one is properly addressing this issue, especially in the whole the system of disaster management is completely failure to understand that what's happening in the mindset of those migrant workers. So we need to understand, and that's how we call, they are the nowhere people, because most of the announcement which was actually made by the state, it's largely focused for the middle class. Largely. It's not focused for the poorest of the poor people. That's why there is a deep feeling that we are nowhere people. The state of insecurity, again, the state is creating a dangerous dependency on the state institution. And we know through our own experiences that most of those state institutions in the democratic institutions are rotten. Are completely collapsed. And because of those system failures, we are now witnessing the poor situation of these migrant laborers. So the whole danger dependency on the welfare state, which actually intentionally or non-intentionally state is again and again provoking and motivating, which is also responsible for creating a huge amount of structural violence in the life of millions of the migrant laborers in the countryside. The second part, undoing injustice. What we are doing right now, after understanding the larger structural roots of the violence, we are trying our best to organize the migrant workers across India. Of course, we are a landless movement. We are not specialized to work on the issues of migrant workers, but we know that they are very close to our subject. And we are taking the help of several other organizations together. We are trying our best to organize a new collective of the migrant workers so that we can fight for their rights and justice. We are also trying to speak out about the progressive land and labor policies. You know, India is a country which is also known for one very progressive legislation passed soon after our independence called Minimum Wage Act. We have also legislation for the protection of the rights of the migrant workers in the country. But none of these legislation are in the proper shape. They've never been properly executed on the ground. So that's how we are trying our best to re-argue, to refocus, to take this issue as an advocacy issue for us and to talk to our respective state government as well as the central government. We are also talking with the labor commissions. I mean, just last week, there was one ordinance passed by a few states, and they actually scrapped one of the very progressive legislation of 1926, which actually allow for the trade unions to work in the company. So through this ordinance, the government was actually trying to completely scrap those progressive provision of 1926. But thanks to a lot of labor union, and we all together, we put a voice, and finally this was actually withdrawn just yesterday. Reforms for the wages. We also trying to understand that the whole structure of the wage, what we call wage code now in India. It's a new name. The whole labor laws, more than 37 labor laws, was actually reduced in the format of one legislation called wage code. And there is a lot of organizations who are opposing. But one thing I would like to point it out here, I mean, how the whole system is actually responsible to provoke the migration. Suppose if it's a labor from Bihar, Bihar is one of the states which is known for the highest number of migrant workers. If he or she wants to work in their own state, according to Minimum Wage Act, he or she will get only 375 rupees. But if he or she want to migrate 1,000 kilometers far from the Bihar and go to the Delhi, the capital of India, they'll earn 415 rupees according to Minimum Wage Act. So you can see that there are 50 rupees of gap. Same labor, if he or she work in their own state, it's less. If he or she migrate to other state, they'll get more. So that means the whole structure of wage code itself is responsible for provoking the migrant workers. And the third is institutional apathy. The most of the labor codes and labor commissions are, as I said, are rotten, inactive, inefficient. And that's how there is a large number of cases are pending in those courts. I mean, especially after the lockdown situation, after the COVID situation in India, according to our interview, in 56% cases of industrial labor, they have not paid anything after the lockdown, in spite of a high-level order by the Ministry of Home Affairs. So that's a clear violation of their own legislation. So we are trying to understand and to address this issue with the help of those legal firms who are working for the rights of the migrant workers on the ground. The third block of my presentation is visiting the new normal. Now we are used to a new phrase, a new normal, but how we understand the new normal, it's that establishing the structural justice. For us, it's a structural justice. If we get the success to establish the structural justice, probably we'll feel that, okay, yeah, it's a new normal. So the first focus is, of course, being a land rights movement, we thought we need a land guarantee legislation in India. We are trying since 2007, it's almost more than 14 years, we are keep fighting for the land guarantee legislation in India. Few states have already been passed and there are some successes, but the central government are still failed to understand this reality of ensuring land to the landless poor. So this is our first focus for ensuring the structural justice. And increasing the public investment in the agriculture sector, which is our advocacy point since decades. The honoring labor. India is a country which is known for 338,000 villages. Largely 65 to 70% population are lived in the countryside. We don't have rural development policy in country. We have urban policy for 30% of the population. We have so many different policies, but we don't have policy of the rural development in India. So our strong argument for the structural justice, for the new normal, is a robust rural development policy in India. We are also arguing for decentralized economy, thrust on a small and cottage industry. Because these small and cottage industry are the backbone of alternate livelihood, what we call economic decentralization. So you cannot think only for decentralization of power. We need to decentralize the whole economic systems also so that we can strengthen the real decentralization in its true spirit. And that's our strong argument for new normal or the structural justice. Strengthening the rural India, as I said, that we need to understand and we need to think about the dignity of those migrant workers, a large sum of migrant workers who are migrating every year, how to understand, how to visualize the new rural India in the coming future. The last 2-3 minutes, I think I have 2-3 minutes. Okay, so the last part is a little bit I'll talk about the global campaign for justice and peace, which you have mentioned in my introduction. The human connect will be the new order for peace and justice. thanks to virus, is actually somehow, I mean, psychologically, we are so much connected. Whenever we see the news, whether it's a Lagos or whether it's a Egypt, we feel somehow, we feel pain. So the human connect will be the new order for justice and peace. And we need to understand that this should be a new building blocks for a new alliances. Day by day, we have convinced ourselves that maintaining and strengthening a global movement are capable of rethinking the very roots of current development model and proposing alternative are necessary to face this crisis and prevent many others. The COVID-19 pandemic has forced the planned campaign of Global Walk 2020 and many similar nonviolent actions to a physical halt. This is just a physical halt. And to understand the emerging virtual survival initiative, re-strengthen and come back again. So I'm pretty sure, Professor Isak, that the graph may be increased somehow post-corona. We wish. The crisis motives many activists around the world not to return to pre-corona normality or abnormality, but to completely change the paradigms of micro socio-economic issues, in particular, the paradigms of development. That's extremely important for all of us. And that's the one small contribution of the global campaign. We are trying our best to build the global campaign around this particular focus. The global march started on the occasion of 150 years of Mahatma Gandhi and Kasturba Gandhi has already covered, before 15th of March, we had already covered 3,800 kilometers between 2nd October to 15th March in India, small part in Nepal, small part in Pakistan, small part in Iran, and a substantial part in Armenia. So the march is halted in Armenia after 15th of March, in the month of March. But the gross idea and inspiration of a just and peaceful world, it remains a new reality for our action and will resume very soon. With this hope, we are planning to reinitiate our march from Georgia from next March 2021 and to take it further. As a campaign coordinator of Global Walk for Justice and Peace, let me invite all of you to walk together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ramesh, for your wonderful presentation. And you mentioned that how important it is to ensure justice. I mean, to address all those structural, violations faced by the people at bottom, and it's quite enlightening, what your organization, what a movement is currently doing, to bring those people at one place, and how you are struggling, and how you are fighting for changing those policies and legislations in favor of the poor and landless people in India. I think there are so much lesson to be learned from your presentation, and hopefully there will be some more questions from the participants later in this webinar session. So now, without further delay, I would like to invite Rehena, Miss Rehena Wagha, to give her presentations and sharing her experience from Pakistan. And I'd like to request you to limit your presentation within 15 minutes. So Rehena, floor is yours.
Thank you, Prakash, for inviting me to the webinar. Since WRN Women's Regional Network focuses on the marginalized communities and on the amplifying of women's voices in marginalized communities in conflict areas regionally. Through its advocacy work, through research. So I will be largely talking about the women in conflict, IDPs, and refugees, and other marginalized segments of society in the region and specifically in Pakistan. In Pakistan, amidst the debate between hard lockdown and soft lockdown, a population of around 220 million means minimal social distancing. Death rate is not as high as it was expected, but there has been a 40% spike in the positive corona cases in the past week or so. In addition to the severe human cost, the COVID-19 crisis has forced Pakistan's already suffering economy to a grinding halt. Social distancing policies necessary to stop the spread of the virus have paralyzed the informal economy and left Pakistan's most vulnerable without income and sustenance. Nearly half of an estimated 8.5 million migrant workers in Pakistan may have been rendered jobless in the informal sector. This week, a senior government official warned that nearly 18 million workers should be unemployed, could be unemployed as a result of the lockdown, which is being progressively eased now. Women in semi-formal or informal work are heavily affected. Beauty salons, tailoring and textile industry, domestic workers are worst affected, as well as the female farmers. So as the wheat season approached in Sindh and Punjab province in Pakistan, women are coming out for the harvest because this is the time for them to collect wheat for themselves and their families, which will be then used for the whole year. It was almost impossible for these women to observe social distancing given the economic constraints they face throughout the year. From the Pakistani government side, we have witnessed the delays in response to a threat that was imminent. Pakistani government changed its narrative from a health emergency to an economic emergency in the recent days and eased out the lockdowns. But largely, in dealing with this economic emergency, COVID-19 response from the government side remains gender blind and unresponsive to the specific needs of marginalized communities or those living in a crisis situation. It doesn't cater to the specific needs of women and other marginalized communities like refugees, temporarily displaced persons, or those settled back recently in the previous militancy hit areas of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Balochistan. As COVID-19 continues to spread, governments across the globe are singularly focused on containing the virus and minimizing loss of life and economic damage. In the process, many of the world's humanitarian crises and simmering conflicts have actually disappeared from everyday news headlines. But that doesn't mean that they have actually suddenly disappeared. In fact, aid workers have warned that COVID-19 and the resultant lockdowns can supercharge existing ethnic and religious divides in some of the most conflict-hit places on earth. There is a great possibility that the extremist groups can come forward to exploit governments' inabilities to fight the extraordinary strain created by COVID-19 pandemic. Humanitarian workers also say that some of the world's most vulnerable communities are already being marginalized and targeted, like the religious minorities who are often scapegoats in times of crisis, and conflict-displaced refugees and impoverished migrants across South Asia. Competition over ever-diminishing economic resources in the lower income groups, where South Asian governments are failing to care for people's needs, have immense likelihood of emergence of all forms of violence and conflict. Aid workers worry that if the virus takes hold in a particular minority community or refugee camp, fear could whip up existing animus against already unwelcome outsiders to genocide level proportions. This is already witnessed in the case of Rohingya refugees being driven out of Bangladesh amidst fear of rise of crimes and violence. They have been turned back by Malaysia and finding no refuge in any other country in the region, thus dying due to hunger and malnourishment under the open skies. Bangladesh rescued a boat in mid-April that had drifted for weeks after failing to reach Malaysia, allowing around 400 Rohingyas to come ashore, but more than 70 people reportedly were already dead while at sea that time. This happened mainly because our governments are simply focused on their own survival and not these stateless Rohingyas, and not how these stateless Rohingyas are doing. It's not simply their concern. Ironically, the UNHCR also reports that it regularly gets half of what it needs to fund its budget. So had already been forced to limit services like healthcare in multiple conflict zones. So much attention is going to other places that these marginalized communities like Rohingyas in Pakistan or elsewhere go unnoticed. The possibility of weaponization of COVID-19 is another issue that has come to the light in South Asia. While sectarian conflict is getting worse due to COVID-19, women have also been a target. If you look at India and Sri Lanka, there's been a lot of vilification of Muslims at large by the members of ruling party particularly. They were targeted after dozens of cases were traced to a forum held in early March by Muslim missionary group Tablighi Jamaat in defiance of social distance rules. In Pakistan and Afghanistan also, Shia pilgrims returning from Iran faced a lot of outrage for bringing coronavirus from across the border. And there are reports of Christians and Hindus in Pakistan unable to access COVID-19 food aid being distributed here. Most expected but most shocking manifestation of weaponization of COVID-19 came from religious leaders in Afghanistan and Pakistan. They blamed women's immodesty for the onset of such a dangerous pandemic to the world. Spread of hate against women and religious minorities is specifically on the rise throughout the region. Ironically, this rising chaos presents opportunity for extremist factions trying to overthrow those fragile governments in South Asia by creating newly embittered, disenfranchised populations among which to recruit or at least influence. We are seeing a number of actors essentially leverage the pandemic or leverage the opportunities of pandemic to advance their agendas, including terrorist groups, armed militias, and even criminal gangs. So this happened in every crisis situation in the past, including that of floods or earthquakes in the country. And this is particularly the case in active conflict zones where the government's outreach is weak. These extremist outfits are able to win people's hearts and recruit more youths in their cadre. People in active conflict zones who are fearful in many cases don't have enough food, they don't have enough medicine, they feel abandoned by their governments, will automatically seek help from these extremist outfits. In anticipation of sectarian tensions, violence against women and other marginalized groups, deployment of strategies in the form of health education for fragile populations, and advice to governments and pre-positioning aid is required. Across multiple conflict zones, educating people in refugee camps and informal outposts of internally displaced communities across Pakistan and or in the region on how not to catch COVID-19, both to prevent the spread of the virus and to head off an outbreak among Rohingya refugees is needed. Because in Pakistan or elsewhere, an outbreak of COVID-19 among refugees can lead the public to label them as carriers, is it adding to the pressure to eject them from the country, as Bangladesh did recently. So to date, coronavirus has infected over 38,000 people in Pakistan. Understandably, Pakistan has limited experience in dealing with a pandemic of this magnitude in its 72 years old history. This crisis has deepened the economic and gender-based inequalities, making millions of women and children vulnerable and at a heightened risk of violence around the world. Many countries have reported a significant surge in domestic violence during lockdown, including Pakistan. This has increased to such a level that UN Women had to term it as a shadow pandemic. Stay-at-home orders are proving more dangerous for women and girls who are being trapped with their abusers, isolated from people and resources that can support them during the pandemic. Domestic and gender-based violence was the top threat to women's empowerment even before the COVID-19 emergency, affecting approximately 243 million women and girls aged between 15 to 49 years worldwide. And in Pakistan, approximately every 1 in 4 women has experienced some form of abuse, ranging from emotional, physical, or sexual violence. This adds to roughly 8 million women facing some form of violence every year in the country. So according to the World Health Organization, in almost 1/3 of these cases, the perpetrator is an intimate partner or someone known. Overburden due to work at home orders and school closures, women are more likely to give up their jobs or choose part-time work to take care of the children or the elderly so that the men can continue to work. This situation is going to further put women under financial control of their spouse. Furthermore, the loss of jobs, reduced work patterns, and work from home scenarios has likely resulted in loss of power for some people, which may be causing an increase in abusive and violent behaviors at home. So control behavior is not always in the form of physical violence. Other common tools of abuse, including isolation from friends, family, employment, constant surveillance, financial control, and strict detailed rules for behavior, and restrictions on access to such necessities like food, clothing, and sanitary facilities. So amidst COVID-19, finding an avenue for escape or a new home is extremely difficult, which may be forcing many victims to stay with their abusers without reporting. So the COVID-19 pandemic is also exposing gender gaps in society as well as in policy making. The lack of prioritization of gender-based violence issues is alarming, particularly in militancy hit areas or among the marginalized communities. The funding allocation is also minimal, and there seems to be a lack of adequate services for survivors. With an already strained health system, the needs of half of the population in Pakistan are not adequately attended to. So these issues most likely will have long-term economic and social repercussions and require urgent intervention and prioritization by the government and donor community. We need policies which are not gender blind, adopting a gender responsive strategy to combat COVID-19 that includes voices of women at all levels of society in decision-making processes and response initiatives is the need of the hour. This would ensure that the vital services that are critical to the needs of women, refugees, minorities, temporarily displaced persons, and people in the far-flung previous militancy hit areas are made available, and that they continue to receive essential services, including healthcare amidst this crisis. Something positive is that the UN Women has recommended the use of sex disaggregated data, including data that can capture the differences in infection rates, economic impacts, burden of care, and incidents of domestic violence and sexual violence. The government of Pakistan's initiatives such as the EHSAS program and Women's Safety Smart app that uses mobile technology to link women to essential support services is quite appreciable. The Ministry of Human Rights also has taken an initiative to provide a helpline and a WhatsApp number to assist women and children report incidents of domestic violence or abuse during the pandemic. However, in a country where only 20% of the women have access to smartphones, according to the Mobile Gender Gap Report 2020, interventions need to be adopted that can access women at all levels of the society. Such initiatives can include deploying mental health and legal services to vulnerable groups as well. COVID-19 is testing humanity in several ways, but this crisis can be turned into an opportunity by bringing women in leadership positions and by amplifying the voices of marginalized groups at all levels. This is possible only if women in leadership positions get to reach to the forums like the G20 and the G7 meetings being held this year and before the UN Security Council. We can collectively take a stand to ensure that the issues and challenges faced by the women, minorities, refugees, IDPs or TDPs, and other marginalized groups in the times of Corona are effectively highlighted and discussed at such forums. Besides the civil society, human rights defenders from across South Asia need to share best practices, not only at the regional level, but also at the national level. How best we can connect to the people at the grassroots, having no or little access to the internet or the related digital tools is a real challenge. Civil society and human rights defenders at the grassroots level are faced with constraints in terms of access to internet facility and other means of communication. Virtual contacts are possible for those working in major cities, but rural populations do not have access to such facilities. And to sum up, I would say that women's rights movement in such circumstances is most likely losing ground that it earned through decades of hard struggles. In Pakistan, connection between urban and rural women's rights movement was already weak. Now it seems, and I'm afraid that it is going to get disrupted in the days to come. So thank you, and over to you, Prakash.
Thank you, Rehena, for your very good presentation and highlighting some of the the pertinent issues that women rights movement in Pakistan is facing, and you also pointed out this how this gender blind COVID response policies of the government, as well as the weaponization of COVID-19 is affecting a different segment of the society, and thank you also for highlighting like where the women rights movement is right now in the time of pandemic, and how that could go ahead. So yeah, we are kind of we still have like 40 minutes, and we need to save some time for question and answers. So without further delay, I'd like to invite Dr. Dinesh Prasain to give his presentations, and I request you to limit within 15 minutes if it is possible. So floor is yours, Dr. Prasain.
Thank you. It's been fantastic listening to all the three predecessors. I think I'd briefly like to touch on the global context, and then zoom into Nepal, because this is a Zoom meeting. I'll spend most of the time on Nepal. I think the COVID-19 will be a turning point in political history. We might be seeing a counter movement. There will be movements, I guess. We might be seeing counter movements, or we might be seeing liberal progressive movements globally. It's really interesting that the coronavirus, in the time of coronavirus, we are having megalomaniac leaders in most or many parts of the world. We have Xi Jinping in China, who wants to rule all his life. We have Trump in the US, and we have Modi ji in India, and we have Bolsonaro in Brazil, examples, and we have Erdogan, etc. I think one of the interesting things is these leaders have come to power not by promising to deliver, not by promising to solve the problems raised by countless social movements for inclusion, or for instance, like the issues of climate change, or the issues of structural violence, as we heard, or the issues of the migrants. They came to power through what I call false narratives that appeal to the majority of the populations. And it's mostly been the nationalist rhetoric. So they could just be rhetorical and come to power, maintain power. But now the crisis is forcing them to deal with the real issues of the people. It's forcing them to deal with health institutions, forcing them to deal with the issues of economic meltdown, the issues of the migrants, the issues of possible riots. So it's asking competence from them and looking at the way they have dealt with the crisis. The megalomaniac leaders are failing. We read reports of actually the women leaders be it in Germany, New Zealand, Taiwan, even Hong Kong, they are doing better, much better. And I think the megalomaniac leaders will face resistance because they were not trained to deliver. They were not trained to deal with the real issues of the people. They could get away with rhetoric, but now probably they can't. Despite the reports or some narratives that China is doing well, we had reports of media, especially resistance through online media at one particular point during the COVID crisis in Wuhan. I think we are far from over of dealing with this crisis. If you have to trust the World Health Organization, the crisis might last for 2 years or even more or even 5 years, we don't know. And we are not yet sure whether the Chinese model has really worked or it will work, or the Trump model will work, whether he'll be able to get the economy back working. So I think going back to Isak's presentation, he highlighted 3 points: the context of the grievances, resource mobilization capacities, and the political opportunity structure. I think budget from Charles Till. I think the grievances part is already there, and it will worsen. And the interesting thing is, when you have a dictator that you can blame, then people might revolt. If it is a pretty popular, or say for instance, if Barack Obama was dealing with the crisis, probably people would give him benefit of doubt, or they would see him working hard. I'm just giving an example. But here people are seeing the megalomaniac dictators not working hard, very incompetent. So I think globally, there is a possibility of uprisings like we have never seen before. It might be like the 1990s or the Arab Spring, and it might be in very powerful states. I left the name of Putin, sorry, include him in. So that's the global context. One of the risks of this moment is incompetent leaders are very good at finding somebody else to blame. So they find an other that they can blame. So there's a lot of blame game that will a nationalist narrative. For instance, Trump is blaming China. China is blaming the US. Indians, especially the Indian leadership, the BJP, I see that narrative in the BJP support media in India, television, the very loud and noisy television debates. There's a lot of blame game going on, and they're trying to link it to China. So they might be appealing to very nativistic, jingoistic, and majoritarian kind of discourses that will silence the minorities, hide the incompetence. So that would be a counter movement. But I don't think they'll be able to succeed because their own power base is suffering. Their own power base. It's not just migrants. It's also we see the middle class, even the elites, the business owners, who will be losing millions of dollars or millions of rupees. So there is that context of a total disconnect between the megalomaniac leaders in major power centers of the world and the people. So I think we are living in a very exciting time. I hope there will be movements, and these movements will be non-violent. I'll come to Nepal now. We are almost in a 2001, 2002 situation. And what is that situation? In 2002, we had another megalomaniac king who was constitutional but was not satisfied with his constitutional role. He wanted to take active power. So he sidelined the parliamentary parties. He wanted a violent solution to an ongoing crisis of the Maoist movement. Initially, some people supported him, but it happens with many incompetent but megalomaniac leaders. They start to fail, and people start seeing that. And they start on top of, with the three categories, Isaac, you presented, I think 2 or 3 other things are very important in, social movements. One is there's a war of narratives. How will you frame your struggle? The megalomaniac leaders, the incompetent leaders will have their own frames to legitimize their rule, to incompetence, to find a blame game. No? But I think the social movements are smart enough, and they have their own counter narratives, and they frame their struggles, frame their grievances in their own ways. In 2002, the king was was okay, he was popular in the beginning, but some intellectuals were seeing the fault lines in the system, the incompetence, but the general people hadn't. So they started aiming. They started a war of narratives with the king. By 2005-06, the king had clearly lost the war of narrative. The media, especially the mainstream media, was valiantly resisting the king's narratives. They were questioning him, they were ridiculing him. Like we see, a lot of media ridiculing so many of the megalomaniac leaders around the world. And there was also, I think, another important thing is the intactness or the fissures among the elites, the ruling elites. Now, that's very important because a lot of people might be against the system, but if the elite is intact, say the ruling party has unity and it has good relationship with the army and the police and the bureaucracy, it can easily resort to repression. It can go the violent way. It will label the opponents as terrorists, anti-nationals, or fueled by some foreign powers, whatever, ignite that xenophobic, feeling among the people and divide the people. But it has happened in history that when the elite is divided among itself, there is fissure, there is conflict among the elites, then you can build alliances. The movements can build alliance, strategic alliance with the opposition among the ruling part, the ruling elite. The third, I think, is the experience of the movements, people in the movement. Have they done similar kinds of movements before? Are they trained? Is there a public memory, collective memory of similar movements before? If these things happen, if the movements, if there's grievances, and if there is, if the movements, counter movements, or movements against the regime can win the war of narratives, frame it in a way that it wins over, it gains the moral authority over the rulers. If there is a conflict among the ruling elite, and if the movement people have a lot of experiences, then I think the situation is very, very right for non-violent movement. When I was involved in the 2002 to 2005-6 movements, peaceful movements. I'm now more into academics, and I have my own little business. But more and more, I sense a situation similar to 2002. We have a prime minister who was very popular, and he was elected based on his populist, nationalist, majoritarian political agenda 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago. Now, when the coronavirus crisis started, he had lost a lot of his moral authority. He has lost his narrative, his framing of his own legitimacy. People had a lot of expectation from him because it was a 2/3 majority government, and people wanted a stable government in Nepal after a long time. So they had good expectations. Even the opposition parties, even the civil society, even the academics, almost everyone gave him benefit of doubt, even the opposition. But it so happens that so he turned into a megalomaniac leader, and he started losing touch, not only with the people, but also with the other elites of his own party, of his own. It so happens, I think, when people have power, it's amazing that they want absolute power. And perhaps they're paranoid about losing that power to their own group of people. So he started alienating many people. And one of the first things he did was, try to ban public gatherings in the most popular places, very symbolic places, which had a history of very, very decent, civil, peaceful movement or gatherings, demonstrations. In Nepal, we know it is Maitigar Mandala. That was one of his very first steps. The second step was he had a very rude, very rude communication minister. He had a background in the media, but he started preaching the media, preaching the public about public morality. And one of the first things he did was to try to ban a lot of porn sites. And interestingly, our prime minister's own website was hacked by some Chinese hackers, and they replaced it with a porn site. I mean, that was the irony. He couldn't ban it, but he was preaching about it. And he was ousted in a scandal, the communication minister, speaking, and he was caught on record speaking a very foul word against the bureaucracy. That's the hypocrisy of all this, megalomaniac. It's amazing. It's amazing. And there were a lot of corruption scandals, and these were pretty open. And the prime minister himself was defending. So he would not let the court decide whether a corruption scandal happened or not. And there was big corruption scandals. And the prime minister has made it his habit to give a clean sheet to all the corrupt ministers. For instance, there was another very interesting incident. There was a popular singer, folk singer, who released an album or a song or a number, which said there's a lot of looting going on, open looting, and that's the context. Whoever can loot, please loot. So it was kind of a satire. And so the prime minister unleashed his a kind of like a youth vigilante group to silence him. And people opposed. There was a lot of public uproar. And the Prime Minister says, it's okay. It's okay. He shouldn't be singing that. Kind of like, so we get this very interesting, like, how people transform when they think they have, like, because at that time the Prime Minister thought probably, I don't talk to him, so I don't know, I'm guessing. So he was thinking probably that he had 2/3 majority, he was the top nationalist, and he also had very, very megalomaniac dreams that he was trying to sell. For instance, like he would connect, Nepal is a landlocked country, but he would have a national, like, a ship carrying a national flag across the ocean. And so he was trying to present himself as a very, very visionary leader. And I think, and he also tried to take away a lot of land, government land, and give it to his own, own people. It so happened that he irritated the Newar community, the cultural community in Kathmandu, because he wanted to take away their customer rights, which they had since the last 2,000, 3,000 years. And he wanted to have an oversight and power over controlling that land. So, so he messed up. Initially, I think people were afraid, but gradually people started resisting. The media started resisting. The Newar community inside Kathmandu Valley started resisting. And there were some very the rape cases, and in which the government incompetence, or even like people suspected involvement of some of the powerful people, and people started resisting that. People disobeyed his command to not to gather in some certain public places. And he started losing that narrative, and people started resisting. I think I'll be short now. I'm giving the context because I think the context is very important. How these situations build up for mass movements. They don't happen overnight. So when we had the COVID-19, we had the first case in Nepal in January, late January. At the time, the government had already lost its war over narrative, and there was shimmering conflict among the elites. And when we started when the Corona crisis really came, there was a big corruption scandal. So there was a big corruption scandal in which his minister, the health minister, and the Prime Minister himself is now believed to be involved in a huge corruption scandal over the purchase of medicine and the personal, protective gears for the doctors and stuff like that. So that was, I think, kind of a last straw. So I think the context is very. So he has lost the narrative. There's the grievances are there, and there's a fissure in the ruling elite. And now we are in an explosive situation. Why? Because Nepal's economy is sustained by the migrant workers abroad. They send remittance. Our banks run through the money that they send, mostly. Formally, it's about 26% of the GDP, but informally, probably it's around 40%. We don't know. Now, we are not going to get that money. Many unemployed people, probably 1 million, 1.5 million, who knows, 2 million people, all the international labor migrants. They will be coming they'll be coming back to Nepal. And we have this around 500,000, 500,000 people who go into the labor market every year. And there are so many unemployed people who have already entered the labor market but have not gone abroad. There are so many people that go to India, and now they're all returning. So you have a government that is considered very, very incompetent, corrupt, and there is a lot of grievances that's going to grow. And the businesses are, especially the tourism industry, like, it has collapsed. It will not revive until the next 2 years for sure. So you have this crisis. And you have, I think, for these movements to like take off, I think you need the leaders who try to resist or ignore these, grievances. They would like to pretend, or they get irritated by any criticism. I think they this, I don't know, kind of like psychology, probably like, that power generates, and we have this, like, So I think the time post-COVID is going to be like, it's going to be an explosive situation, and I think we have to be creative. I think people will be creative. For instance, like, the sorry, they are using a lot of online media, the mainstream media, through the op-eds or through the, like, news stories. Lot of resistance through the online media. For instance, like, switching off the lights, the power, like, switching off power. That one of the, like, new parties, Vivekshil Nepali is, and also some others are doing, or like, holding placards and like posting your photographs through the social media, but also going to the street itself. The main opposition party, student wing, went to the street. I mean, that breaks the social distance laws, but still, I think one of the last points I would like to highlight is about experience. In Nepal, we've had these peaceful, almost peaceful, mostly, movements almost every 10 years, almost 10 years, from 1950s onwards, almost invariably. So we have that wealth of experience. We have experienced the authoritarian rulers, but we've also experienced ousting them. So there is always that dialectical relationship. This is kind of a seesaw. And I think we were very experienced, in toppling dictators, and probably we like doing that. That's kind of a, like, part of our political psychology, our political culture. So next 1-2 years, it's going to be, the situation is, very, very volatile. It's almost like volcanic for these non-violent movements to erupt. Thank you. I think I spoke a little longer.
Okay, thank you, Dinesh Thai, for your wonderful presentation, and for your time. And thank you, first of all, thank you all the speakers, for making your time, and thank you so much for all the participants, attentively listening, throughout the webinar. And Center for Social Change would like to organize similar kind of event even in the future, and we'll definitely disseminate that information through our Facebook page and our personal social media pages. And we will also put this, we have recorded this this webinar, and we would like to share with you all, like, in couple of days time, and it will also be in YouTube and other social